Saturday, 28th February, 1863. I had a long talk with Dr. Warner today after rounds. He asked me how I get along with the chaplain, seeing as how I spend a great deal of time writing letters with him. I answered that we work fine together, so long as he doesn't practice his sermons on me. Then, without any further preface, he asked if I would like to stay with his family for a while, since he and Dr. DePriest are nearly finished with the period for which they had volunteered, and will be returning home at the end of March or beginning of April. I've decided to go with them, though I have grave misgivings about the whole thing. It seems charity is all I have to live on at the moment, and Warner is more than willing to sustain me. He tells me he won't press me on religious matters, as he realizes it upsets me, but of course he won't be able to resist. The fact that any talk of God still throws me into dejection and anger is bothersome, though. Why is it that months after I determined to give him up, I still dwell on verses that arise in my brain and feel such animosity towards all of my former beliefs? Perhaps, like the fronting lady in Shakespeare, I do protest too much. Or perhaps there is so much about which to be angry, I will feel the effects for some time to come. The family had been up well before daylight to ensure not only that Teague made it to Newkirk in time to catch the stage to Canton, but also that he could eat a proper breakfast and not leave them empty. Now, in his last minutes as part of their household, Teague watched Mrs. Dow's sons heft the trunk with Lucy's dresses to the rear of the carriage and deposit it on top of his own trunk. It was light enough to see past the lamp glow from the windows of the house, and from his position on the porch Teague could make out Anna Lee's black figure amid the gray of the orchard several yards away. She was leaning her back against one of the trees and watching the preparations as Teague had been doing. She turned to face him when he stepped off the porch and walked over to join her. "You're not going to cry for me, then?" he said. "No, I may in a few hours, but not now." "And you have no final words of wisdom for me to ponder on my way?" "I spent them all last night." Teague looked overhead to the random striping of the tree's bark. "Shakespeare, then?" He met her eyes again. "Something like, 'Parting is such sweet sorrow.'" Annalee laughed. "You are no Romeo, and I am no Juliet. Let us say rather, thou and I are too wise to woo peaceably." "So we're a comedy, then?" He leaned beside her against the tree. "No, nor a tragedy," she sighed. "We just are." They stood silent for a moment, and then Annalee spoke again. "And you won't come back." Teague stared at the trees that in the growing light were starting to take on some color. "In about 30 years I may come visit you, when all your 8 and 9 babies are grown and you must sit all alone on your porch and sip lemonade. But by then you won't be able to stomach lemons, so let's say you're sipping tea. And we'll talk about these times and about each other's families, and we'll chastise one another for not keeping up the correspondence. And I'll laugh politely at your stories, even though I won't know any of the people that inhabit them, and you'll laugh at mine. And amidst all this elderly frivolity, I'll mention this nagging subject that I'll have wondered at for all that time. I'll say, if I had asked you 30 years ago if there was a good reason, a momentous, vitally important reason to come straight back to Oakshade, what would you have answered? And then what will you say?" Annalee took a moment to reply. "I will say, it's a shame you never asked." Teague nodded and saw that DePriest was carrying Lucy's sleeping form to the carriage. "That's just what I was thinking." He started walking toward his traveling companions. "Goodbye, Annalee," he called, without looking back. She had not replied in like manner by the time he had seated himself, and he supposed he was glad that instead of standing before the house with her parents to see him off, she went inside. There was a sense of being rushed in his departure that agreed with him. He had been so long accustomed to ruminating over the purport of every moment of his life, but for once it was good not to have the time to think of anything except what lay ahead of him. He was going to see his sister. He would have to break her heart, but he was going to see her. And then he was going to a city where the demands of work would occupy his thoughts. He could foresee several years before him when he would be free of this introspective tendency that brought him nothing but doubt and grief. He would be with his sister, he would be independent, and Anna Lee would pass from his consciousness like a vapor. He watched out the carriage window as DePriest mounted his tall bay and motioned for Rob Dow to start the horses. With the first lurch of movement, Teague's illusions of a life mechanical in its conduct dissipated, and he knew Anna Lee would never leave his mind. She would marry, have children, die, but to him, she would always wait there in the gray of the orchard, just a few inches away from his hand, if only he could bring himself to touch her. The carriage hit an especially large dip in the driveway, and Lucy snored her objection to the jolt and changed her position so that her head was propped up on Teague's arm. He smiled at the child. She probably wouldn't remember him this time next year. He would pass from her memory with the monsters under her bed. That was as it should be. He was a figure of all that was wrong in the country, and a child had no business holding on to the memories of these times. He moved a strand of hair out of her face and fingered the edges of the handkerchief that lay between the pages of the Bible in his pocket, before looking back out the window to the road passing under them. That black earth brought thoughts of Henry in his room in Sandusky, counseling him to look toward the dawn. His friend had not understood that there was no point in Teague hoping that any day would be all right. For some people, it could not be so. But for all the foolishness of the gesture, Teague looked up from the earth, and through the tiny, thin leaves of the trees glimpsed the dappled light of sunrise.